Hello and welcome to the Hub Lectures. This is advanced Bible study in which we interact with the scriptures to arrive at a fully biblical worldview. The title of this series is Divine Human Rebellions. I'd like you to take a look at my website, colindye.com, and there you'll find out about the prophetic and apostolic teaching, equipping and training ministry to the nations. You will also be able to access all the Hub material together with the videos in playlist form and PDFs of the lecture notes. The lecture notes are much fuller than what I can cover in the actual lectures, but also there are footnotes and references, so make sure you check it out. This lecture is of course free, but if you follow the QR code on the screen, you'll be able to make a donation to this teaching ministry to ensure that more and more videos can be made and distributed. I want you to send in your questions, and you can do that in the comment section below, or you can go to my website and there you will be able to get an email address to contact me directly. I'll try and get to as many questions as I can, but don't forget, some of your questions are likely to be answered in subsequent sessions. If you enjoy this video, then please share it with others. You can also press like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so that you won't miss any future videos. This lecture now is entitled The Sethite View of Genesis 6, verses 1 to 4. But before we go there, let me do a bit of summary and recap of the last session. If you watched that last session, you will know that Genesis 6 verses 1 to 4, or really through to verse 8, it's an important explanation as to why the complete annihilation of humanity was necessary through the flood, God's judgment through the flood, because this rebellion, Genesis 6, is a divine human rebellion focusing on supernatural beings, the sons of God, who left their proper heavenly abode and entered the earth realm, taking on physical bodies, a form of corporeality. And as in that form, they're able to take women, the daughters of man, as sexual partners, and produce hybrid offspring called the Nephilim, the giants. And this is the origin of the giant clans who continued as supernatural opponents of God, his people and his purposes, and of course the redemptive plan. And that's why Joshua in the conquest of Canaan is commanded to eradicate them completely. And so the rebellious sons of God in Genesis 6 cause deepening corruption to spread rapidly and widely amongst humanity, which provokes God to act, as I say, in this severe judgment. It's a kind of divine reset that was necessary, in which Noah and his family are saved through the ark, but the Edom commission continues. So that's the kind of supernatural interpretation, but how about the natural interpretations? I mentioned last time that there are two main ones, the Sethite interpretation, which we're coming to in this session, but also the kingship interpretation, that the sons of God is a title for kings, ancient kings, who were often given quasi-divine status by their culture, and that they are the ones who began freely to take wives to themselves from whoever they choose, at the beginnings of polygamy and so on. Well, we're not covering that explanation so much, but just to say that yes, the Son of God can be a kind of description of ancient kings. That's true, but never the term sons of God. In fact, the term sons of God in the plural is really only used one way, to express the divine beings, or to denote the divine beings, the Bene Elohim, the supernatural beings that God created earlier and were witnesses of the creation. And we covered a lot of that in the first series, All Things Visible and Invisible. So I say that sons of God is a description used in the Old Testament only of supernatural beings. That is, of course, if you don't take the Sethite view and interpret sons of God differently. And so, as I say, this is one of the main naturalistic interpretations of Genesis 6. The sons of God are human, not divine beings. Now, the supernatural interpretation of Genesis 6 was prominent in Jewish teaching up until the late 2nd century and early 3rd century. Also in Christianity, the supernatural interpretation was the standard interpretation up to a certain point of time, when really beginning with Augustine, who had his own reasons for rejecting the supernatural interpretation. He had early involvement with the Manichaeans, a Manichaean cult, which relied very heavily on the mythological background of the ancient Near East, and also placed a lot of emphasis on first Enoch. And Augustine seems to have kind of reacted against that and thrown out the supernatural interpretation because of its link with Second Temple Judaism and the non-canonical book, First Enoch. So the Sethite view, this regards the phrase sons of God in Genesis 6 as referring not to supernatural beings, but to human beings, in particular, the godly line of Seth. So Adam, of course, he's called son of God, at least in the New Testament. And Cain, of course, is taken out of the lineage because he, as brother of Abel, nevertheless was wicked. And so a new godly line begins with Seth. And that's the basis of the Sethite view. And in Genesis 6, the godly sons of Seth, the sons of God, the godly lineage of Seth, that's contrasted with the daughters of humankind, the ungodly line of Cain. Just as a little bit of an aside, how is it that only the men are godly, but the women are not godly? How is it only the men are from the lineage, the godly lineage of Seth, but the women here happen to be of the ungodly line of Cain? Well, that's another story. So let's have a look at the history of the Sethite interpretation. Now, it seems that the Jewish rabbis, they moved away from the supernatural interpretation by around the end of the 2nd century AD. And in Christian tradition, the supernatural view of Genesis 6 seems to have been very much prominent until, perhaps really we may argue, till the writings of an influential historian, Julius Africanus, from the late 2nd century or early 3rd century. Julius Africanus was, as I say, a historian. He influenced the great historian Eusebius, so he was influential, and he didn't take the supernatural view. But then also from around the time of Augustine, in the late 4th century AD, the church has been predominantly on the side of the Sethite view, which identifies, as I say, the sons of God as the godly offspring of Seth and the daughters of man as the ungodly offspring of Cain. It was also taught by Aquinas in the 13th century, picked up later by Martin Luther, John Calvin, and the other theologians of the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. So Augustine wrote about this in The City of God, and Aquinas wrote about this in his Summa Theologica. Martin Luther wrote about this in his commentary on Genesis, Creation, Sin and the Flood, and John Calvin wrote about it in his commentary on Genesis. So why would these people move away from it? I think we've seen that Augustine, he overreacted. the Manichaeans, of which he was a part for a time, placed so much emphasis on this kind of mythology and a lot on the mythological background of the ancient Near East. And they had very, very spurious views about that. And also they loved First Enoch. And when Augustine gave up his connection with the Manichaeans, he very possibly threw out the baby with the bathwater. And what about perhaps the Reformers? Well, I think the Reformers also might have been guilty of a little bit of overreaction, because the Book of Enoch is not accepted in the Protestant canon of Scripture. It doesn't appear in our Protestant canon, and it appears in the apocryphal sections or writings of benefit, but not deemed even by the Catholic Church to be fully inspired. And I think there might have been an attitude amongst the Reformers. No, we are anti-Catholic. Whatever the Catholics do, we don't do. Now, I'm not suggesting that 1 Enoch should be in the canon of Scripture, but it is an important document coming from that period of theological development that took place between the Testaments. We call this Second Temple Judaism. So much in the New Testament presupposes the ideas of Second Temple Judaism. Let me give you a couple of examples. For example, Satan is never used as a proper name in the Old Testament. It's always description of an office, of a function within the divine council. But by the time we come to the New Testament, Satan is a proper name, and he is the arch enemy of God. Also, sons of God, referring to divine heavenly beings. We don't find that so much in the New Testament, only in the Old Testament. Instead, we have the term angels. Also, the place of demons, and the language used to describe demons is very, very different in the New Testament than from the Old Testament. And these terms and cultural use of these terms and the background to the use of these terms, we owe to Second Temple Judaism. However, when we come to the New Testament, we're not talking about apocryphal Second Temple Judaism literature, pseudo-epigraphic literature. We're talking about the inspired Word of God. And so whenever a New Testament writer takes expressions such as Satan, expressions such as demons or angels, we know that that is coming with divine authority, and we're entitled to use those as well. And this is the background to our New Testament, which after all is a fulfillment of Old Testament teaching and understanding. And many doctrines are brought to fulfillment in the New Testament. And so we can embrace the New Testament as fully inspired, but at the same time recognize that the language of the New Testament, much of it anyway, depends on language and the culture of Second Temple Judaism and Jewish writings, not just, of course, 1 Enoch, but the Dead Sea Scrolls and other contemporary literature. So this is perhaps why the Reformers turned away from this supernatural view. And it is, I must say, the dominant view today. I need you to know that in most Bible commentaries and most Bible exponents, expositors of Scripture, they take the Sethite view. And there are lots of reasons for that. One of them is that the literature coming from the period, the Mesopotamian period, which highlights the Mesopotamian background to Genesis 6, which takes an entirely supernatural interpretation. That literature was unknown, really, certainly in popular commentaries, unknown even in some parts of scholarship until around the year 2010, when a particular scholar began to interpret the texts, Mesopotamian texts. He was a scholar able to do that. And in a sense, there's been a rediscovery of the Mesopotamian background. So if you have a commentary or anybody who's relying on material which was published before 2010, you won't have any of this. But gradually, it's being introduced into modern scholarship. And in fact, there seems to have been a little bit of a revival of this idea of the supernatural interpretation of Genesis chapter 6 in scholarship, where many scholars are recognizing that that sheds a tremendous amount of light on the story of Genesis 6. And now, while it is the dominant view, I ought to say that there's this other view of sons of God referring to kingship. But as I've already said, there's no reference in ancient Near Eastern literature to divine kings in plural. This is always not the sons of God, but son of God. And so we are not treating that in this series of lectures. So let's go into a little more detail into the Mesopotamian background. So as I say, in 2010, there's a bit of a watershed moment. The scholar's name was Amar Anus. He translated and published many ancient Mesopotamian tablets, and that has shed a lot of light on the background, the Mesopotamian background to Genesis 6. And Amar Anus, I've given it a reference in the PDF, his work was on the origin of the Watchers, a comparative study of the antediluvian wisdom in Mesopotamian and Jewish traditions. In true scholarly fashion, quite a mouthful. Just to let you know that the term Watchers is the key term used of the Bene Elohim, the sons of God, in Second Temple Jewish literature and also in the Book of Enoch, basically referring to the same thing. So when we look at the Mesopotamian background, we see stories of the Apkallu who come and who are able to spread their form of wisdom and knowledge amongst humanity, particularly Babylonian society and Babylonian culture. And they are attributed as the ones who made Babylonian culture great. They are the heroes in the story. And the Apkallu kind of roughly corresponds to the term Watchers. The Apkallu are sometimes described as divine or part divine, 1/3 divine, half divine. And so there's a lot of correlation or a lot of similarities between the Mesopotamian background and the story in Genesis chapter 6. But there are also, perhaps even more importantly, remarkable differences. And these differences, well, they make all the difference, because the sons of God in Genesis 6 are not the heroes. They are evil divine beings, and they are in rebellion against the one true God. And so it seems that the author to Genesis, two things we can deduce. First of all, the author of Genesis 6, he is presuming that his readers know the background, because he doesn't give us all the details. Peter and Jude give us a little more detail than is found in Genesis 6, but we don't have the full Mesopotamian background appearing in Genesis 6. This was part of the culture of the day. People would have known about these stories, and all he had to do was just tell the story in the way he does, and people know exactly what he's talking about. But the difference is, the second thing is, not just he presumes the knowledge of the Mesopotamian background, but he also contrasts it. The differences are radical and they're stark. He seems as if the author in Genesis 6, the author of Genesis 6, is correcting the record, and it's kind of a polemic against the idolatry of Babylon, the idolatrous practices that the children of Israel were struggling with and struggled with throughout their history. And so here we have similarities but differences. Now, 1 Enoch chapter 6 to 11, and the book of Jubilees, chapter 4 and 5. These are important Second Temple texts when understanding the background. That's where we go to a lot of our sources to find out what Second Temple Judaism was saying, not just about Genesis 6, but about the Mesopotamian myths in general. And this is, in all likelihood, it's almost certain as far as I'm concerned, that this is where Peter and Jude get their information from. And they, under divine inspiration, they don't buy everything hook, line and sinker, but they do select stuff from Second Temple Judaism and under the inspiration of Scripture present it to us as New Testament believers. And so we can rely on it. We definitely can rely on it. We don't have to put the book of Jubilees or the book of Enoch into the biblical canon in order to realize that it is beneficial and profitable. Under the inspiration of Scriptures, as New Testament writers with apostolic authority take that material and give it to us for our edification and our understanding. But even more than that, seeing the sons of God as rebellious supernatural beings corrupting humanity solves a puzzle. The puzzle is the jump between Genesis chapter 6 and verse 4, which is the coming of the Nephilim and the men of renown, to this corruption having spread throughout all humanity, so that the thoughts of humanity now, blanket thoughts of humanity, are only evil continually. What's happened? What was this sin that's committed in Genesis chapter 6 verses 1 to 4 that warrants such or explains such spread of corruption to the point where God regrets that he made humanity and decides that he's going to have to obliterate it entirely and start again? What was it? And this supernatural evil coming through the sons of God and the Nephilim, and all the knowledge that was passed on through this corruption being passed on to humanity, that begins to make sense of the passage. Now, I mentioned the apkaulu earlier. These are the equivalent of the watchers or the sons of God. Apkaulu is the Mesopotamian name. The watchers is the name used in Second Temple Judaism and also the Bible, as I will show you, but mainly the term is the sons of God. So these are supernatural beings. In the Mesopotamian literature, they're called the apkalu. In Second Temple Jewish literature, they're called the watchers, but in the biblical writers, they're called sons of God, and also the term watchers appears, particularly in the book of Daniel. I want you to have a look at Daniel 4 verse 17. Here it says, the sentence is by decree of the watchers, the decision by the word of the holy ones, to the end that the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will, and sets over it the lowliest of men. So that is Daniel chapter 4 verse 17. There are two other verses which I list there, verse 13 and verse 23. What's happening here? Now you'll recall Nebuchadnezzar had one of his dreams. And in this dream, a messenger, a watcher came and delivered a message. And this dream, he saw a tree growing high and tall to the heavens, a great tree. And then he saw somebody come and cut that tree down, chop it to a stump, and there it was exposed to the earth and atmosphere for a time. Now, nobody could interpret this dream except Daniel, and Daniel interprets it. So let's have a look. First of all, verse 13. This is Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel chapter 4, verse 13. This is Nebuchadnezzar explaining his vision. He said, I saw in visions of my head as I lay in bed, and behold, a watcher, a holy one, came down from heaven. And then he goes on to talk about the decree. And he said, this is the decree let a beast's mind be given him, and let 7 periods of time pass over him. And then verse 17 is a significant passage. It says, this sentence is by the decree of the watchers, the decision by the word of the holy ones. So here we have the watchers, the holy ones, part of God's heavenly council. It is their decree. But when we go on and see in verse 24, it says, this, when Daniel gives the interpretation, he says, O king, you are the tree, you're going to be chopped down, you're going to lose your mind until you acknowledge that God is the true ruler, and then you're going to be restored. In verse 24, he says, this is the interpretation, O king, it is a decree of the Most High, which has come upon my Lord the King. So it is both a decree of the Most High and a decree of the watchers. A little later on in this series, we're going to talk more about the divine council. We've already encountered the divine council in 1 Kings 22, where God involves his heavenly sons of God, the spiritual beings, in the decision as to how the judgment of Ahab is going to come about. And Micaiah the prophet, he says, I saw a spirit come and say, I will be a lying spirit and in the mouths of the prophets of Ahab. And those prophets all prophesied, Ahab, you're going to be successful. But Micaiah says, this is a lying spirit that God sent as a judgment upon Ahab. And this, the actual choice of this as a methodology to bring about Ahab's judgment, was made by one of the Elohim. And God says, okay, I'll go with that. So this is in essence what the divine counsel is about. Just as God involves us in his work, as we are to rule and have dominion on the earth, so God involves his heavenly counsel, his heavenly sons, in his government. And here we have in Daniel another example. It's the decision of God to bring this judgment to Nebuchadnezzar, but he allows the watchers to determine it. And so it is a decision of the watchers, but also a decision of God. And this is how we see the word watcher used in Daniel, which is part of the Hebrew Bible. Actually, it's part of an Aramaic section, but it's part of the Hebrew Bible. And so let's move on a little bit. In order to examine the Sethite view, we've got to understand the thinking behind it. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, we see after the fall, there's going to be holy and unholy seed, the offspring of the woman and the offspring of the Nakash, the serpent. Genesis 3:15 says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. So what is this holy and unholy seed? Well, quite clearly, it is not physical seed. Not physical seed. In a sense, of course, the seed of the woman is Christ, absolutely the case. But that's not the main emphasis here. When we talk about holy and unholy seed, godly and ungodly offspring, we're talking about it in a spiritual sense, in a metaphorical sense. For example, in John chapter 8 and verse 44, Jesus speaks to a certain group of the Jewish leaders who rejected him and who were reasoning not according to the Holy Spirit, but are reasoning according to their own spiritual nature. So Jesus says, John 8:44, you are of your father, the devil. So the seed of the devil are those who follow the devil, and the godly seed are those who follow God. It's a matter of faith and obedience, not linear, not earthly, physical lineage. And then also we need to appreciate that those who follow the Sethite interpretation make a great deal of the seed of Seth versus the seed of Cain. So Adam being the son of God, he's called a son of God. Adam, the son of God, yeah, okay, we'll accept that, highly metaphorical, but created by God, therefore the son of God. And so, therefore, Seth was a son of Adam, being made in the image of Adam. So he's a son of God. And then it goes on to talk about, well, it doesn't say it in the Bible, but this theory goes on to extrapolate from there and say the son of Seth then will be a son of God and the grandson of Seth, and so on, right up until the Genesis 6 incident. So, and this seems to have a little bit of confirmation in the New Testament in 1 John chapter 3, verse 12, where it says, we should not be like Cain, who was of the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil and his brother's righteous. So there is a kind of seed of Cain. That's those who follow the evil one and who hate the people of God and do badly against the people of God. And their deeds are evil. Why did he murder his brother? Because his own deeds, Cain's deeds, were evil and his brothers were righteous. So the unrighteous always persecute the righteous. But is this really establishing some lineage of the sons of God being the sons of Seth and the daughters of man being the lineage of Cain, the wicked, unbelieving, persecuting, corrupting, seducing group of people? Well, I've got to say this. There is absolutely nothing in the biblical text that links sons of God with the sons of Seth. And there's nothing in the biblical text that links the daughters of man with the sons of Cain, or indeed the seed of the serpent. We just have this statement in Genesis 6, sons of God and the daughters of man. It doesn't identify the sons of God with the lineage of Seth, and doesn't identify the daughters of man with the lineage of Cain. So remember also that everywhere else in the Old Testament, the sons of God, when it's found in its plural expression like that, is only used of divine beings, not of human beings. Now in the New Testament, sons of God is characteristically used of us as human beings, followers of Christ, but not so in the Old Testament. We have Israel, my son. We have Israel being recorded as God's son, of course, and we have the king being recorded as my son, but never sons of God as an expression in the plural, never used of humans, only used of spiritual beings, divine spiritual beings. And why should Genesis 6 be the one exception? So what about Genesis 4, verse 26? This is another key verse for those who follow the Sethite interpretation. And Genesis 4:26, this is their preferred translation. It says, to Seth also a son was born, and he called him Enosh. At that time, Seth began to call upon the name of the Lord. You'll see I put that in square brackets because the word Seth doesn't appear in the original Hebrew, but some subject has to be, some object has to be provided. We'll come to that in a moment. But those who follow the Sethite interpretation like to read Seth there in the text. Now, most translations actually substitute another word. They don't say at that time Seth began to call on the Lord. They say at that time people or humankind began to call on the name of the Lord, as in the ESV, the English Standard Version. To Seth also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. At that time, people. Again, I put that in square brackets because that's not in the original. It has to be supplied by the translator to complete the sentence. At that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. So before we look at this business of having to supply a word to make sense of the Hebrew, before we go there, let's point out that neither translation, whether you call Sethites or whether you call it people calling on the name of the Lord, neither translation links Sethites to sons of God, or indeed establishing a godly genealogy through Seth. It would simply say that from that time, Seth began to call upon the name of the Lord. But that doesn't say anything else about anybody else. It's reading something into the text. And there's no justification to read into the text something that is not there. Now, I mentioned about having to supply a word in the text, a subject, because there is no subject in the Hebrew text here. The word humankind or people doesn't appear, neither does the word Seth. Literally, all we have is to call was begun. Now, that doesn't make sense. A translator is going to have to find a subject. To call was begun. And so it doesn't specify the subject of the verb. Who is calling? So translators have to supply one. And those who follow the Sethite interpretation suggest the most natural subject in the sentence is Seth. I don't see it's the most natural subject. And anyway, Seth was not the only one who was calling on the name of the Lord. Others did as well. Now, if the standard translation is correct, from that time, people began to call on the Lord. The Sethite view falls because there's nothing. It has nothing to do with Seth. But also, as I said, there's no textual reason to identify this with the sons of God. The godly seed of Seth as the sons of God, there's no textual reason. It's being read into it as there is no textual reason in Genesis 6 to say that the daughters of humankind are the ungodly seed of Cain. The Sethite view reads meaning into the text that is simply not present. Well, that may seem pretty clear, but let's not forget that there is a remarkable theological pedigree behind this Sethite view. I mean, we're talking about Augustine. I mean, the greatest mind, the greatest theologian of his century. We're talking about great people like Thomas Aquinas, very influential philosopher, teacher, scholar. We're talking about Calvin, Luther, and others. Now, we have to be very brave people to stand up against that pedigree. But why is it that the Sethite view appeals to Bible teachers and to these theologians? Well, the opposite view, they would say, is absurd. The idea that spiritual beings could take on human form and actually, through sexual intercourse, reproduce children. Now, in reading some of those critics, some of them, Luther and others, would accept that there have been demonic manifestations in history and contemporary history for him in which people thought that was happening. And we can explore different cultures today. I was born in Africa and spent a lot of time in Africa and ministered in Africa. And we know that there are many stories of spirit children being produced. Now, whether this is actually the case or whether this is some fantasy or some kind of deception, we don't know. But certainly as a fact that people testify to this having occurred today, it's certainly not so absurd to be outside of their credibility. And don't forget, what we are seeking to do is establish a fully biblical worldview. And I believe that so many of these passages, these difficult passages, are kind of demythologized out of existence. We're prepared to believe in the supernatural in so many ways, but not when it comes to awkward passages like this. It is absurd. Well, it's surely absurd to the modern Western rational mind. It's not absurd to many other cultures, contemporary cultures today. And I get it. I get it that some rationalistic thinking has crept into our theology. And I think we need to be consistent, actually, because there's a lot of supernaturalism in the Bible. And if there's supernatural in other places, why not here? Another reason is that this kind of, the background, at least the Mesopotamian background, is all about ancient Near Eastern mythology and in pagan mythology. Or it's taken up in extra biblical writings. Therefore, we shouldn't pay attention to it. And they also will go and say, actually, the sons of Seth is the best explanation of the sons of God. And one more reason. They say this contradicts Luke chapter 20 and verse 35. Let's have a look at Luke 20 verses 34 to 36 to get the context. And this is where Jesus is dealing with people who are saying, who didn't believe in the resurrection, and if you have had 7 wives and they all die, when you get to heaven, whose wife is this person going to be? This was the Sadducean challenge of Jesus, and Jesus says, you are wrong. Don't forget, you err because you do not know the scriptures nor the power of God. But in his rebuttal of this confrontation, Jesus says, Luke 20 verse 34, and Jesus said to them, the sons of God, the sons of this age marry and are given in marriage, but those who are considered worthy to attain to that resurrection and to the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage, for they cannot die any more, because they are equal to angels and are sons of God, being sons of the resurrection. So this does say that in the resurrection we'll be elevated to a heavenly status as sons of God, which is somewhat akin. And we can also, as we've seen before, say that it is even superior to the angels because we will be judging the angels. But what about this, there being no marriage in heaven? Well, it's clear that there's no marrying or giving in marriage in heaven or in the resurrection. The angels do not need to reproduce. They are already immortal beings. Immortal beings do not reproduce. And in heaven, they're not given reproductive bodies. They are spirits. And also we will not reproduce in heaven because we will be immortal. So that much is clear. That's all that Jesus is saying. But he says nothing about what would happen if angels left heaven behind and took on human bodies. Could they not marry women? Nothing in Luke chapter 20 contradicts that possibility. So this is really no evidence against the supernatural view. Now, let's just bring this to conclusion with some arguments against the Sethite view. No biblical text identifies sons of God with the lineage of Seth. No biblical text identifies the daughters of man with the daughters of Cain. There's no prohibition in marriage at this point. So what is the sin, the great sin that is there in this flood story? What is the great sin? There's no prohibition of marriage. You might suggest that if they are taking wives just as they choose, there's a degree of sensuality in there, but that there is no catastrophic breaking of divine order, as is in the case in the supernatural view. And so also the Sethite view ignores the antagonism of the giant clans in subsequent history and the necessity for the giant clans to be eradicated in totality. We've seen also that Peter and Jude take the supernatural view, and drawing from sources from intertestamental or special Jewish sources of Second Temple Judaism. They add some elements to the revelation of Genesis 6, and they interpret it in line with this Mesopotamian backstory, and certainly would not have seemed absurd to them. And so the sons of God clearly refer to divine beings in other parts of the Old Testament, and I list some scriptures for you there. Finally, we must be consistent. Angels can and do take on temporary form. And God himself took on, the angels do and can take on temporary physical form. And God, in the person of Christ, has taken on permanent physical form. Why could not angels take on a corporeality capable of producing children? And also, don't forget that believing in the supernatural view does not commit you to the understanding that these were angelic beings taking on physical form and actually entering into physical sexual intercourse with women in order to produce offspring. This may well be a euphemism for producing children without sexual intercourse. After all, God himself, Yahweh, had a role in the birth of Isaac without involving sex. And don't forget, of course, this is clear. The sons of God is used consistently of spiritual beings in the Old Testament. Well, that's the end of this teaching. We've pushed it right to the limit today. But I want to invite you to participate in giving and supporting this ministry. We're giving these lectures free, but please consider making a donation, and you can do that through the QR code. And also, don't forget, please, to share, to like, and to subscribe to my YouTube channel. And in the meantime, don't forget, visit my website. And so until next time, God bless you.